Out of every 100 Japanese soldiers who participated in a banzai charge during World War II, only 3 would survive to see the next sunrise. They had a life expectancy measured in minutes once they left their trenches. Yet, Japanese commanders considered these mass suicide attacks both their greatest weapon and their most tragic waste of human life. The psychology behind these charges was more terrifying than the charges themselves. And now, you're going to see why. When people think about the Pacific War, they usually picture island-hopping campaigns or kamikaze pilots. But banzai charges were something entirely different. These weren't desperate last stands by cornered troops. They were calculated military tactics rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and twisted by Imperial Japanese military doctrine into something far more deadly. The term banzai itself means 10,000 years, a traditional wish for the emperor's long life. But by 1944, it had become synonymous with mass death. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was worse than death, that capture brought dishonor not just to themselves, but to their families back home. This wasn't just military training. It was psychological conditioning that turned ordinary men into willing participants in their own destruction. The charges typically happened at night or during dawn hours when visibility was poor. Japanese commanders believed darkness would give their forces the element of surprise and make it harder for American defenders to pick targets. They were partially right about the surprise factor, but completely wrong about the survival rates. To understand why banzai charges were such a nightmare for the participants, we need to look at how they actually worked. The typical charge involved anywhere from 50 to over 1,000 soldiers armed primarily with rifles, bayonets, and sometimes swords. Officers carried katanas and led from the front, often being the first to die. Soldiers were given specific instructions before each charge. Fix bayonets, remove all identification to prevent intelligence gathering if captured, and advance in waves at a running pace while screaming banzai at the top of their lungs. The psychological purpose was to terrify the enemy, but it also served to steel the nerves of the attackers themselves. The average banzai charge covered between 200 and 800 yards of open ground. At a running pace, that meant soldiers were exposed to enemy fire for anywhere from 45 seconds to 3 minutes. But here's the thing that made these charges so deadly. American defenders had time to prepare. Machine gun positions were pre-sighted on likely approach routes. Artillery batteries had coordinates already plotted. Mortar teams knew the exact range to every piece of cover between the Japanese positions and American lines. When hundreds of screaming soldiers came charging across open ground, they weren't facing surprised defenders. They were running into a carefully prepared killing field. The M1 Garand rifle could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The Browning automatic rifle delivered 500 rounds per minute. The .30 caliber machine gun could sustain 450 rounds per minute for extended periods. When multiple weapons focused on the same target area, the mathematical probability of survival dropped to nearly 0. Japanese soldiers knew this. They understood they were running towards certain death. Yet they did it anyway, driven by a combination of military indoctrination, cultural honor codes, and often alcohol distributed before attacks to dull fear and pain. Now, let me tell you about one of the most devastating banzai charges in Pacific War history. It happened on Saipan on July 7, 1944, and it involved over 4,000 Japanese soldiers in what would become known as the largest banzai charge of the entire war. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien was commanding the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, when his forward observers reported massive troop movement in the Japanese lines. It was 4:30 in the morning, still dark, and the usual sounds of jungle warfare had gone completely silent. That silence should have been their first warning. At exactly 5:15 a.m., the ground began to shake. Not from artillery, but from thousands of feet running across the volcanic soil. American sentries peering into the pre-dawn darkness saw what looked like a human wave emerging from the jungle. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers, including walking wounded, administrative personnel, and even civilian volunteers, were charging directly at their positions. O'Brien had prepared for this possibility. His men had spent weeks setting up interlocking fields of fire, registering artillery targets, and stockpiling ammunition. But nothing could have prepared them for the sheer scale of what they were facing. The charging mass of humanity stretched across a front nearly half a mile wide. The Americans opened fire with everything they had. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery created a wall of lead and steel. The noise was deafening. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like a deadly fireworks display. But the Japanese kept coming. Even as men fell by the dozens, the survivors continued their charge, stepping over the bodies of their comrades. What happened next defies imagination. The first wave of Japanese soldiers actually reached the American lines. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across multiple positions. O'Brien himself was fighting with a pistol in one hand and a bayonet in the other when a Japanese sword cut him down. He would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. But the charge didn't stop there. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers continued attacking for over 3 hours. By the time the sun came up, the ground between the two forces was carpeted with bodies. Of the 4,000 Japanese who participated in the charge, fewer than 100 would survive the day. That's a casualty rate of 97.5%. The psychological impact on the American defenders was almost as devastating as the physical carnage. Many soldiers later reported that the sound of thousands of men screaming banzai while running toward certain death haunted them for the rest of their lives. But this wasn't the only case where banzai charges produced horrific casualty rates. On Attu Island in May 1943, Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki led the final 1,000 survivors of the Japanese garrison in a last desperate charge against American positions. The attack began at dawn on May 29th, and by noon, Yamasaki and 95% of his men were dead. Private First Class Joe Martinez was manning a machine gun position when the charge began. He watched in horror as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers ran directly into his field of fire. Years later, he would write that he fired over 2,000 rounds that morning, and never once saw a Japanese soldier turn back or seek cover. They just kept coming until there were no more left to come. If you think the previous stories were incredible, consider what happened on Iwo Jima in March 1945. By this point in the war, Japanese commanders knew that banzai charges were essentially suicide missions, but they continued ordering them anyway, believing that even in death, their soldiers could inspire fear in American troops and delay the inevitable invasion of Japan. Major Yoshitaka Hori was one of the few Japanese officers to survive the war and leave detailed records of what these charges looked like from the Japanese perspective. He described soldiers writing final letters to their families, drinking sake, and singing traditional songs before affixing bayonets and charging into machine gun fire. Hori wrote that most soldiers knew they wouldn't survive, but they also knew that their families back in Japan would be told they died heroically for the emperor. The alternative, surrender or retreat, would bring shame that could last for generations. For many, death in a banzai charge seemed like the only honorable option available. The charge Hori witnessed on March 26, 1945, involved 350 men from the 145th Infantry Regiment. They attacked American positions held by the 5th Marine Division just before dawn. The Marines had been expecting this kind of attack and were ready with overlapping fields of fire from multiple machine gun positions. The charge lasted exactly 12 minutes from start to finish. When it was over, 347 Japanese soldiers were dead. 3 survivors were found severely wounded among the bodies. That's a survival rate of less than 1%. Even by banzai charge standards, this was extraordinarily deadly. Against all odds, one of those 3 survivors was a young sergeant named Takeshi Yokoi. He had been shot multiple times but managed to crawl into a shell crater and play dead until the Americans moved past his position. Years later, he would describe the experience as watching his entire unit commit suicide while he accidentally survived. The effectiveness of banzai charges in achieving military objectives was essentially zero. They rarely captured significant ground, almost never broke through American defensive lines, and typically resulted in the complete destruction of the attacking force. Yet, Japanese commanders continued ordering them throughout the war. The psychological warfare aspect was more successful, but not in the way Japanese leaders intended. While these charges did traumatize American troops, they also convinced many Americans that Japanese soldiers were fanatics who would never surrender. This perception contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than invade Japan's home islands. Official Japanese military records show that during the Pacific War, approximately 60,000 soldiers participated in organized banzai charges. Of these, fewer than 2,000 survived the initial attack. Many of the survivors died from wounds within hours or days. The actual survival rate may have been as low as 2%, making banzai charges one of the deadliest military tactics in human history. American forces developed specific countermeasures for these attacks. Artillery batteries were trained to fire defensive barrages on predetermined coordinates. Machine gun crews practiced rapid target switching. Infantry units learned to create killing zones that maximized casualties while minimizing American losses. The psychological conditioning required to convince soldiers to participate in these charges left deep scars on Japanese society that lasted long after the war ended. Survivor guilt affected not just the handful of men who lived through the charges, but also their families and communities who struggled to understand how honor could be found in mass suicide. Today, military historians study banzai charges as examples of how cultural and military indoctrination can override basic human survival instincts. They represent one of the darkest chapters in the Pacific War, where tactical desperation combined with cultural programming to create a form of warfare that was as psychologically devastating as it was militarily ineffective. The men who participated in these charges weren't cowards or madmen. They were products of a military system that valued death over defeat and honor over survival. Understanding their story helps us comprehend not just what happened in the Pacific, but why it happened, and why such tactics must never be repeated. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out by subscribing.